The champagne glass shattered against marble flooring as Zara Akafer watched the news feed from her penthouse office. 17 floors below, Manhattan hummed with its usual chaos, but her attention was locked on the breaking story. 3 Navy SEAL teams had gone dark somewhere over the Zagros Mountains. No radio contact, no GPS pings, just silence where America's most elite warriors should be. Her assistant knocked twice before entering. "Ms. Akafer, the Pentagon is on line 3. They're asking for." "Tell them no." Zara's voice carried the kind of authority that had built a tech empire from nothing. "Whatever they want, the answer is no." But even as she said it, her fingers unconsciously traced the faded tattoo on her left shoulder. Most people saw the expensive suit, the Forbes covers, the billion-dollar company. They never looked close enough to notice the small black anchor partially hidden beneath perfectly tailored silk, or the way she still stood like someone accustomed to briefing rooms and flight decks. The phone rang again. This time she recognized the number. "Admiral Morrison." Her voice had gone cold, professional. "I thought we agreed our business was concluded." "Tempest, we need you." The old man's voice cracked slightly on her call sign, a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years. "It's not about money. It's not about contracts. It's about bringing our people home." Through her floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see a commercial airliner banking toward LaGuardia, its navigation lights blinking against the afternoon sky. Once, she had owned that sky. Once, she had been the ghost that other pilots whispered about in ready rooms, the one who could thread an FA-18 through mountain passes that existed only in nightmares. "I'm retired, Admiral." Retired people don't keep current flight certifications. Retired people don't maintain security clearances. And retired people sure as hell don't have hangar space at Teterboro leased under shell companies. Zara closed her eyes. The weight of 3 years fell away like shed skin, revealing the woman underneath, the one who had earned her call sign not through recklessness, but through the kind of precision that turned impossible into inevitable. Tempest, the storm that came when others couldn't. "Send me the briefing packet," she said finally. "Already in your secure server." Of course it was. Morrison had always been 3 moves ahead, even when she was a lieutenant commander learning that respect was earned one perfect landing at a time. Now he needed her to prove it again, in skis where failure meant more than damaged pride. The champagne stain spread across Italian marble like spilled blood, dark and irreversible. Outside her window, the sky waited. The secure folder contained 47 pages of sanitized intelligence, but Zara could read between the redacted lines like sheet music. 3 SEAL teams inserted via MH-60 helicopter for what should have been a routine extraction of a high-value target. Radio contact lost at 3:47 hours local time. Last known position, grid coordinates that made her blood run cold. She had flown missions over those same mountains 4 years ago, back when her call sign carried weight in rooms that didn't officially exist. The terrain was unforgiving, razor-sharp ridges that could shred aircraft like paper, weather patterns that changed faster than forecasts could track them, and tribal territories where outsiders were neither welcomed nor forgotten. But that wasn't what made her hands shake as she scrolled through the tactical assessments. It was the target profile buried on page 32. Khalil Nazari, arms dealer, former Afghan intelligence operative, and the man who had put a bounty on her head after she had turned 3 of his weapons caches into smoking craters. The Pentagon's best analysis suggested a coordinated ambush. Satellite imagery showed the SEALs' helicopters had made it to the landing zone, but thermal signatures indicated the aircraft were cold, either shut down or destroyed. No signs of the teams themselves. Morrison's personal note was typically brief. Weather window closes in 18 hours. Conventional assets can't operate in those altitudes. Need someone who speaks the language of impossible. Zara stood and walked to her private elevator, pressing the button for the basement level that didn't appear on any building directory. The doors opened onto a space that looked more like a military briefing room than the sub-basement of a corporate headquarters. Wall-mounted displays showed real-time satellite feeds, weather patterns, and communication intercepts from around the globe. Her fingers moved across the secure keyboard with muscle memory that 3 years of civilian life hadn't dulled. Within minutes, she had accessed National Reconnaissance Office feeds, CIA station reports from Kabul, and NSA signal intelligence from the target area. The picture that emerged was worse than the sanitized briefing suggested. Nazari hadn't just ambushed the SEALs. He was broadcasting their capture on encrypted channels, using them as bait for exactly the kind of rescue operation that was already being planned. Traditional military doctrine would suggest overwhelming force, multiple helicopters, fighter escorts, maybe even a drone strike to clear the area first. But Zara could see what the Pentagon's planners couldn't. The weather patterns showed a storm system moving in from the west, the kind that would ground everything larger than a sparrow within hours. The terrain analysis indicated that multiple aircraft would create acoustic signatures visible for miles in those mountain valleys, and the intelligence reports suggested Nazari had shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, the kind that turned rescue helicopters into falling debris. She picked up her secure phone and dialed a number from memory. "Morrison." "I'm in," she said, "but we do this my way." "What do you need?" "Something fast, something quiet, and something that doesn't officially exist." The hangar at Teterboro Airport looked like any other private aircraft facility from the outside, gleaming corporate jets and maintenance crews in clean uniforms. But Hangar 7 was different. The building had been constructed to military specifications, with reinforced walls, electronic countermeasure shielding, and a security system that would have impressed the Pentagon. Zara's heels echoed against polished concrete as she walked past the cover aircraft, a Gulfstream G650 that served as her public face, all leather appointments and mahogany trim. Behind it, hidden beneath a tarp that looked deceptively casual, sat the reason she maintained this facility. The aircraft that emerged as her crew pulled away the covering was unlike anything in conventional inventories. Sleek as a bullet, matte black from nose to tail, with engine intakes that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. The manufacturer's designation was classified, but pilots who had seen it called it the Ghost for obvious reasons. "Ma'am," the voice belonged to Tech Sergeant Maria Vasquez, one of 3 people who knew this aircraft existed. "Pre-flight complete, fuel topped off, countermeasure systems are green." Vasquez had been Zara's crew chief during her active duty years, the kind of technician who could coax performance from machines that others declared impossible. When Zara had transitioned to civilian life, Vasquez had followed, ostensibly as head of maintenance for the corporate fleet. "Flight plan filed?" Zara asked, already knowing the answer. "Corporate executive transport to London, with fuel stop in Newfoundland. Should give you a 12-hour window before anyone starts asking questions about where you really went." The Ghost specifications were burned into Zara's memory. Maximum speed of Mach 2.3, service ceiling of 65,000 feet, range of 4,000 miles without refueling. But the numbers didn't capture what made it special. This aircraft had been designed for missions that couldn't be acknowledged, piloted by people who didn't officially exist. Zara began her walk-around inspection, hands moving over control surfaces and engine intakes with the familiarity of ritual. Every rivet, every seam, every access panel told a story of engineering, pushed beyond conventional limits. The skin was made from materials that absorbed radar waves rather than reflecting them, while the engines had been designed to run so quietly that the aircraft could pass overhead unheard. "Threat assessment came in an hour ago," Vasquez said, handing her a tablet. "Intel suggests Nazari has at least 2 SA-24 missiles, Russian-manufactured, effective ceiling of 19,000 feet. Zara nodded. The SA-24 was a formidable weapon, capable of tracking modern aircraft with infrared and ultraviolet sensors. But the Ghost had been designed by people who understood such threats. Its engine exhaust was dispersed through mixing chambers that reduced heat signatures to nearly ambient levels, while the skin itself incorporated materials that made it difficult for heat-seeking missiles to maintain lock. Still, nearly invisible wasn't the same as invisible, and in the mountains of Afghanistan, even ghosts could die. She climbed into the cockpit, her body settling into the ejection seat with muscle memory that felt like coming home. The instrument panel was a symphony of digital displays and analog backups, every switch and indicator positioned exactly where her hands expected to find them. Above her head, the canopy was made from materials that looked like ordinary glass but could stop rifle rounds. "Tower, this is Zara 1 requesting taxi clearance." Her voice carried across the radio with professional calm, using the call sign that would appear in official logs. Nothing about Tempest, nothing about ghosts or impossible missions. Just another corporate flight heading overseas. The taxi to runway 1 took 4 minutes. As the Ghost rolled past civilian aircraft, Zara could see pilots and ground crews turning to look. Even hidden beneath layers of corporate respectability, the aircraft drew attention like a magnet draws steel filings. The tower cleared her for takeoff at 13:47 hours local time. Zara advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling 60,000 pounds of thrust push her back into the seat as the Ghost accelerated down the runway. At 180 knots, she pulled back on the stick, and the aircraft leaped into afternoon sky with the eagerness of a thoroughbred given its head. Below her, Manhattan shrank to toy dimensions, then disappeared entirely as she climbed through cloud layers toward the stratosphere. Ahead lay 7,000 miles of ocean, mountains, and the kind of mission that separated pilots from legends. At 45,000 feet, the Ghost settled into cruise configuration as Zara engaged the autopilot and began her real mission planning. The aircraft's communication systems were hardened against interception, allowing her to access intelligence feeds that were updated in real time. The picture that emerged from scattered reports and satellite imagery was grimmer than the Pentagon had initially assessed. The 3 SEAL teams, call signs Neptune, Poseidon, and Triton, had been conducting what should have been a textbook extraction. Their target, Dr. Elena Vasquez, no relation to her crew chief, was a nuclear physicist who had been working with terrorist organizations to develop radiological weapons. Intelligence suggested she wanted to defect, providing both herself and critical information about weapons programs that kept analysts awake at night. But the extraction had gone wrong from the first moment. Surveillance satellites showed the MH-60 helicopters reaching the landing zone on schedule, but the infrared signatures suggested they had been destroyed within minutes of touchdown. The SEALs themselves had vanished into the mountain landscape, their GPS beacons going dark one by one until only silence remained. Nazari's involvement changed everything. Zara had encountered him twice during her active service, once over the skis of Kandahar, where she had turned his convoy into scrap metal, and once in a briefing room where CIA analysts had explained exactly why he was too dangerous to ignore. He was the kind of enemy who understood that wars were won through patience and precision rather than overwhelming force. The Ghost's navigation system showed her current position as somewhere over the Atlantic, officially bound for London with fuel stops as needed. But the aircraft's actual course was more complex, a route that would take her over polar airspace where civilian radar coverage was sparse and military attention was focused on larger threats. She activated the secure communication system and input Morrison's private frequency. "Tempest is airborne," she said simply. "Copy, Tempest. Update on the ground situation. We've confirmed Nazari is holding our people in a compound approximately 12 miles north of the original target zone. Heavily defended, built into mountainside caves that make conventional assault nearly impossible. Rescue assets. Ranger Battalion is standing by in Tajikistan, but they can't insert without significant air support. The storm system you warned about is moving faster than predicted. Weather window may be as short as 6 hours. Zara checked her navigation display. At current speed, she would arrive in the target area in roughly 4 hours, giving her a narrow margin for both reconnaissance and action. The Ghost carried no weapons. Its mission profile was intelligence gathering and infiltration rather than direct combat. But Zara had learned long ago that the most effective weapon was often information used at precisely the right moment. "Send me everything you have on the compound layout," she said. "Architectural plans, satellite imagery, communication intercepts, anything that might give us an advantage." "Already uploaded to your secure server. Tempest. The president is watching this one personally. These SEALs have families, people who are counting on us to bring them home." Zara understood. 17 years in the Navy had taught her that every mission was personal to someone, that behind every set of coordinates and tactical objectives were people whose lives hung in the balance. But understanding the stakes and successfully completing the mission were different challenges entirely. The Ghost continued its northward track, climbing toward the edge of space where the sky turned from blue to black, and the curve of the Earth became visible on the horizon. At this altitude, few aircraft could operate, and fewer still could maintain the kind of speed that made intercontinental travel seem routine. But speed was only part of what made this mission possible. The real advantage was that almost no one knew the Ghost existed. The data upload finished as Zara crossed into international airspace, officially beyond the reach of civilian air traffic control. The compound imagery was sobering, a fortress built into living rock, with multiple entrances, overlapping fields of fire, and defensive positions that had been constructed by someone who understood modern warfare. Nazari hadn't just captured the SEALs. He had drawn them into a trap that had been months in the making. The storm clouds appeared first as a line on the horizon, dark and threatening against the pale sky of early morning. Zara had been flying for nearly 6 hours, the Ghost maintaining cruise speed through polar airspace, where the aurora borealis painted green and gold streamers across the canopy above her head. Below, the landscape had changed from ocean to ice to the brown and gray mountains of Central Asia. She began her descent at 5:47 local time, bringing the aircraft down through altitude layers where commercial traffic was sparse and military radar coverage was focused on more conventional threats. The Ghost's stealth characteristics weren't perfect. No aircraft was truly invisible to modern sensors, but they were sufficient to blur the line between presence and absence, especially for operators who weren't expecting to see anything at all. The terrain below was unforgiving. Peaks that reached above 20,000 feet, valleys so narrow that aircraft had to thread between ridge lines like needles through cloth, and weather patterns that could change from clear skies to whiteout conditions in minutes. This was the kind of environment that killed pilots through small mistakes magnified by physics and geography. But Zara had learned to fly in conditions like these. Her early training had been conducted in Alaska, where instructors believed that pilots who could handle Arctic conditions could handle anything the world threw at them. Later, during combat deployments, she had developed the kind of situational awareness that separated survivors from statistics. The secure communication system crackled to life. "Tempest, this is Overwatch. We have updated intelligence on your target area." Overwatch was Morrison's operations center, a facility that officially didn't exist but somehow managed to coordinate missions across multiple time zones and classification levels. The voice belonged to someone Zara didn't recognize, but the professionalism was unmistakable. "Send it," she replied. Satellite imagery shows increased activity around the compound in the last 2 hours. Vehicle movements, personnel repositioning, Communications intercepts suggesting they know a rescue operation is inbound. Nazari may be preparing to move the prisoners. Zara felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that came with missions where the margin for error was measured in minutes rather than hours. If Nazari moved the SEALs to a different location, finding them again could take days or weeks, time that captured personnel rarely had. ETA to target area. 47 minutes at current speed and heading. She could push the Ghost harder, maybe cut that time by 10 or 15 minutes, but doing so would increase her heat signature and make the aircraft more visible to ground-based sensors. The balance between speed and stealth was always delicate, especially when flying solo into hostile territory. The storm system was moving faster than the weather forecasts had predicted, with cloud formations that suggested wind shear and possible icing conditions at altitude. Zara could see lightning flickering inside the dark mass, the kind of electrical activity that could fry aircraft electronics or create turbulence violent enough to tear wings from fuselages. She had perhaps 2 hours before the weather made flying impossible, maybe less if conditions deteriorated rapidly. Time enough for one pass over the target area, maybe two if she was very careful and very lucky. Not enough time for mistakes. The Ghost descended through 25,000 feet as Zara began her approach to the target area, flying a route that would bring her over the compound from the southeast, the direction where the morning sun would make visual spotting more difficult for ground observers. Her hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, configuring systems for low-level reconnaissance, while maintaining the kind of situational awareness that kept pilots alive in contested airspace. At 15,000 feet, she could see the compound with naked eyes, a cluster of buildings and defensive positions carved into a mountainside, connected by roads that switchbacked up from the valley floor like scars. Vehicles were positioned at strategic points, their placement suggesting people who understood how to defend against aerial attack. But Zara wasn't planning to attack, not yet. First, she needed information. The mission clock showed 6:34 local time when Zara began her reconnaissance run, the Ghost descending to 8,000 feet above ground level as she approached the compound from the southwest. At this altitude, she was theoretically vulnerable to shoulder-fired missiles, but her speed and the aircraft's stealth characteristics made targeting difficult for anyone without sophisticated radar systems. The first pass revealed details that satellite imagery had missed. Guard positions that were occupied by professionals rather than militia, communication equipment that suggested coordination with outside forces, and defensive preparations that indicated Nazari had been expecting exactly this kind of response. More troubling were the three heat sources in what appeared to be a bunker complex built into the mountainside itself. The thermal signatures were consistent with human beings in an enclosed space, possibly the captured SEALs, but confirmation would require closer inspection than a single reconnaissance pass could provide. Zara banked the Ghost into a climbing turn, using the aircraft's stealth characteristics to mask her presence as she gained altitude for a second approach. The compound's defenders had shown no signs of tracking her, but experienced operators sometimes waited until targets presented themselves more clearly before revealing their capabilities. Overwatch, this is Tempest. I have eyes on the compound. Copy, Tempest. What's your assessment? 3 possible heat signatures in the underground complex, consistent with our missing personnel. Defensive preparations suggest they've been expecting us. I'm going to need a distraction to get closer. What kind of distraction? Zara was quiet for a moment, running tactical calculations in her head. The compound's position made direct assault nearly impossible. Too many overlapping fields of fire, too much natural cover for the defenders. But the same geography that made it defensible also made it isolated, dependent on communication links and supply lines that could be disrupted. How quickly can you get me a cyber warfare package? She asked. What are you thinking? If I can't get close enough to confirm the hostages undetected, maybe I can convince Nazari's people to bring them outside. The idea was audacious, even by the standards of missions that didn't officially exist. Rather than attempting a direct rescue, Zara was proposing to manipulate the situation so that the defenders would expose their most valuable assets, exactly the kind of psychological operation that intelligence agencies spent months planning. But months were a luxury she didn't have. The storm system was less than 90 minutes away, and the weather window for any kind of operation was closing rapidly. Stand by, Tempest. Zara used the pause to circle the compound at maximum range, mapping defensive positions and looking for weaknesses in Nazari's preparations. The man was thorough. She had to give him that. Every approach route was covered, every piece of high ground was occupied, and the communication equipment suggested he could coordinate with outside forces if necessary. But thoroughness sometimes created its own vulnerabilities. People who prepared for every contingency sometimes became predictable in their unpredictability, following patterns that careful observers could exploit. Tempest Overwatch. Cyber package is being uploaded to your secure server now. Fair warning, this is experimental technology, not fully tested under field conditions. Understood, what does it do? Electromagnetic pulse simulation. Should be able to disrupt electronics in a localized area without the permanent damage of an actual imp. Theory is that it will cause temporary communications failures that look like equipment malfunction rather than deliberate attack. Zara downloaded the software package and began integrating it with the Ghost's electronic warfare systems. The aircraft had been designed with offensive cyber capabilities, though using them would reveal technologies that were supposed to remain classified. But bringing the SEALs home alive was worth more than protecting secrets that would eventually be declassified anyway. The cyber attack began at 6:51 local time, invisible waves of electromagnetic energy cascading down from the Ghost as Zara made her third pass over the compound. She watched through her targeting systems as communication equipment began failing in sequence. First the main antenna array, then backup systems, then the portable radios carried by individual guards. To the defenders below, it would appear that their electronics were suffering cascading failures, possibly due to solar activity or equipment age. Natural instinct would be to troubleshoot the problems, bringing technical personnel out of protected positions to examine antennas and communication links. More importantly, if Nazari wanted to move his prisoners, he would need working communications to coordinate the operation. The temporary disruption might force him to delay any movement until systems could be restored, giving Zara additional time to plan an extraction. She was circling for a fourth reconnaissance pass when the first surface-to-air missile launched from a concealed position near the compound's northern perimeter. The threat warning system screamed as the SA-24 missile acquired lock on the Ghost's heat signature, its seeker head tracking the aircraft's infrared emissions despite the stealth systems that were supposed to make such targeting impossible. Zara had perhaps 3 seconds before impact, not enough time for conventional evasive maneuvers, but possibly sufficient for something more creative. She rolled the Ghost inverted and pulled into a dive that would have shattered the wings of most aircraft, using gravity and the mountain terrain to break the missile's tracking solution while deploying every electronic countermeasure the aircraft carried. Chaff clouds bloomed behind her, creating false targets for radar-guided weapons, while infrared flares attempted to decoy heat-seeking systems. The missile detonated 40 feet above and behind the Ghost's tail section, close enough for shrapnel to spiderweb the canopy, but not close enough to bring the aircraft down. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit as systems reported minor damage to control surfaces and communication equipment, but the Ghost remained flyable. More concerning was what the missile launch revealed about Nazari's capabilities. SA-24 systems weren't simple shoulder-fired weapons. They required trained operators and sophisticated targeting systems to be effective against modern aircraft. The fact that they had achieved lock despite the Ghost's stealth characteristics suggested either very skilled personnel or very advanced equipment. Possibly both. Overwatch, this is Tempest. I'm taking fire from ground-based SAM systems. At least one SA-24 confirmed, possibly more. Are you hit? Minor damage. Aircraft remains operational, but they've got better equipment than intelligence suggested. Zara climbed rapidly, putting distance between herself and the compound, while assessing the tactical situation. The missile launch had been well coordinated, suggesting the defenders had been tracking her despite the electronic warfare attack. That implied backup communication systems that hadn't been affected by the cyber package, or simply operators who were experienced enough to engage targets without electronic coordination. Either way, additional low-level passes were too dangerous to attempt without better intelligence on the compound's defensive capabilities. Tempest were showing a second storm cell moving in from the northwest. Weather window is now estimated at 45 minutes maximum. 45 minutes to locate and extract 3 Navy SEALs from a heavily defended compound, in mountain terrain that was about to become impassable due to weather. The mathematics of the situation were unforgiving, but Zara had built her reputation on solving problems that others considered impossible. She needed a new approach, something that would bypass Nazari's defenses rather than confronting them directly. The answer came to her as she studied the compound's location on her tactical display, noting how the buildings were positioned relative to the natural terrain features. The fortress had been built to defend against conventional attack from the valley floor, with overlapping fields of fire that covered all obvious approach routes. But the engineers who had designed the complex had made an assumption that might prove fatal. They had assumed that any rescue attempt would come from ground forces supported by conventional aircraft operating from established bases. They hadn't planned for a ghost arriving from directions that normal aircraft couldn't survive. The approach that formed in Zara's mind would require flying through mountain passes that were barely wider than the Ghost's wingspan, using terrain features to mask her approach, until she was close enough for the kind of precision that separated legends from casualties. It would also require landing the aircraft in conditions that violated every safety protocol she had ever learned. But the SEALs were running out of time, and conventional rescue operations were impossible in the approaching weather. Zara began her descent toward the valley floor, threading the Ghost between mountain peaks that rose like stone cathedrals on either side of her flight path. At this altitude, the air was thick enough to provide good aerodynamic control, but thin enough that engine performance was reduced and stall speeds were higher than normal. The navigation system showed a possible landing site approximately 2 miles from the compound, a stretch of relatively flat ground that had been carved by ancient glaciers but was now dry and rocky. Satellite imagery suggested it was long enough for the Ghost to land and take off again, though margins would be tight. More importantly, the site was positioned so that anyone approaching the compound from that direction would be invisible until they were within a few hundred yards, close enough for the kind of direct action that Navy SEALs trained for, if she could reach them, and if they were in condition to fight. The landing approach required precision that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits. Zara configured the Ghost for short field operations, extending flaps and landing gear while maintaining just enough airspeed to prevent a stall. The rocky ground rushed up to meet her as she flared for touchdown, the aircraft's main wheels touching down with a thump that rattled every rivet in the airframe. She had landed in hostile territory, alone, with a damaged aircraft and a rapidly closing weather window. Now came the hard part. The Ghost's engine spooled down to idle as Zara conducted a rapid post-landing inspection, checking for damage that might prevent takeoff when the time came to leave. The shrapnel from the SA-24 missile had left its mark, several small holes in the left wing, and a crack in the canopy that would need attention before attempting high-altitude flight, but nothing that compromised the aircraft's basic airworthiness. She activated the secure communication system one final time before beginning the ground phase of her mission. Overwatch, this is Tempest. I'm on the ground and proceeding on foot to the compound. If you don't hear from me in 30 minutes, consider the mission failed and implement whatever backup plans you have. Tempest negative. You're not trained for ground combat operations. Wait for backup. But Zara was already shutting down systems and preparing to leave the aircraft. Her naval aviation training had included survival courses, but she wasn't a special operations soldier. What she had was 23 years of flying experience, intimate knowledge of how military operations worked, and the kind of stubbornness that had made her successful in environments where failure was often fatal. The equipment she carried was minimal: a sidearm, basic survival gear, and the kind of portable electronics that allowed her to communicate with both the Ghost systems and external support. Everything else would have to be improvised from whatever she could find. The approach to the compound took 18 minutes of careful movement through terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and expose intruders to observation. Zara moved as quietly as possible, using rocks and scattered vegetation for cover while studying the defensive positions that Nazari's people had established. The cyber attack had been partially successful. Several guard positions appeared to be experiencing communication difficulties, with personnel moving between locations in patterns that suggested they were trying to restore contact with their command structure. But the defenders remained alert and professional, suggesting that electronic disruption alone wouldn't be sufficient to create the kind of opening she needed. What she needed was inside information, details about the compound's layout, the location of the prisoners, and the timing of any planned movements. The kind of intelligence that could only be obtained through direct observation or human sources. That's when she saw him, a guard moving between defensive positions, carrying equipment that suggested he was responsible for maintaining communication systems. More importantly, he was moving alone, separated from other personnel by the kind of distance that created opportunities for someone who understood the timing of such things. Zara had never been trained as a special operations soldier, but she had grown up in neighborhoods where survival sometimes required skills that weren't taught in schools or academies. She waited until the guard passed her concealed position, then moved with the kind of silent precision that came from understanding exactly how much noise would attract attention. The confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds. The guard never had time to call for help or reach for his weapon. When it was over, Zara had both the information she needed and the equipment that would make her plan possible. According to the captured radio, Nazari was indeed planning to move the prisoners within the hour, using the approaching storm as cover for a transfer to a more secure location. The 3 Americans were being held in the underground complex she had identified from the air, but they were scheduled to be brought to the surface in 20 minutes for transport. 20 minutes to position herself for an intercept. 20 minutes to turn a rescue operation into something that might actually succeed. The storm's advance guard arrived as Zara positioned herself along the route that the prisoners would have to take to reach the vehicles Nazari had prepared for their transport. Wind gusts were already making movement difficult, and the first raindrops were beginning to fall with the kind of intensity that promised worse weather to follow. But the approaching storm also provided cover, the kind of environmental noise and visual obscurity that made precise observation difficult and sudden action more likely to succeed. She keyed the captured radio to the frequency that the guard had been monitoring, listening to traffic that revealed more about Nazari's operation than hours of intelligence analysis had provided. The man was coordinating with outside forces, possibly government elements that were providing him with information about American rescue operations. More troubling was the indication that he had additional prisoners, not just the 3 Navy SEALs, but also Dr. Vasquez, the nuclear physicist who had been the target of the original extraction mission. If Nazari succeeded in moving all 4 to a more secure location, future rescue attempts would be nearly impossible. The radio crackled with movement orders. Prisoners would be brought to the surface in 10 minutes, transported in 2 vehicles with heavy escort, destination unknown but estimated travel time of 4 hours. Once they left the compound, Zara's window for intervention would close permanently. She checked her watch, 7:43 local time. The weather window was closing rapidly, and even if she succeeded in freeing the prisoners, getting everyone back to the Ghost and Airborne would require precision that left no room for delays or complications. But Navy SEALs were trained for exactly these kinds of situations. If she could get them weapons and basic intelligence about their situation, they might be able to turn a desperate rescue attempt into the kind of coordinated operation they had trained for. The first vehicle appeared right on schedule, followed 30 seconds later by the second. Through the rain and wind, Zara could see armed guards and what appeared to be bound prisoners in the back of each truck. The convoy moved slowly, carefully, drivers who understood that the mountain roads were treacherous even in good weather. She had positioned herself at a point where the road curved around a large boulder, creating a brief blind spot where vehicles would be vulnerable to attack from above. It wasn't much of an advantage, but it was the only tactical opportunity the terrain offered. Zara had one chance to turn the situation around, one moment when surprise and desperation might overcome superior numbers and firepower. As the first vehicle rounded the curve, she discovered that 23 years of flying experience had taught her something about timing and precision that applied to more than just aviation. The improvised explosive device, constructed from materials scavenged from the compound's communication equipment, detonated beneath the lead vehicle's engine compartment at exactly 7:51 hours. The explosion wasn't large enough to destroy the truck, but it was sufficient to disable the engine and bring the convoy to a stop in precisely the location where Zara had prepared her secondary positions. What happened next took place with the kind of choreographed violence that separated professionals from amateurs. The guards responded exactly as their training dictated, establishing a perimeter, checking for additional threats, calling for backup support. But their responses were based on assumptions about enemy capabilities that didn't account for someone who understood their procedures well enough to anticipate them. Zara had spent 4 years studying military tactics from the perspective of someone who provided air support to ground operations. She understood how small units moved, how they communicated, and how they reacted to unexpected contact. More importantly, she understood their weaknesses. The guards had positioned themselves to defend against attack from the surrounding terrain, but they hadn't considered the possibility that their primary threat might come from someone who was already inside their defensive perimeter. The captured radio allowed her to monitor their communications while remaining invisible to their situational awareness. When the team leader called for backup, she knew exactly when additional forces would arrive. When they reported their position, she understood exactly how they had deployed their personnel. And when they began moving the prisoners from the disabled vehicle to the backup truck, she knew exactly when they would be most vulnerable. The first guard went down to a precisely aimed shot that came from a direction he wasn't watching. The second managed to return fire, but his shots went wide as Zara moved to a position she had prepared specifically for this phase of the engagement. By the time the remaining guards understood they were under attack by a single opponent, 2 of their number were down, and the tactical situation had shifted decisively. But the real turning point came when the Navy SEALs realized what was happening. Chief bet.